Alright, there we are. Excuse me. Good evening and welcome to tonight's stream. Tonight we are continuing to read the Dunwich horror, and we are going to finish the story that is the Dunwich horror. And I do have a bit of a thing to mention towards the end. I will save that for later, but yeah. We are about halfway through the story. So how do I surmise what happened? Essentially, there's this village in New England where it's a bit closed off from the outside world, and the townsfolk are very strange people, and there's a bit of inbreeding going on, and this woman has a son, and he despises his mother, but he is very close to his grandfather. And it's strange because they keep buying cattle, and they keep taking the cattle in every so often to their house, and they keep constructing around the house, making it bigger, making changes, and the townsfolk cannot understand why this is. And his grandfather had passed away, and this boy, he grew up very, very quick. Within about 10 years of living, he happened to fully mature, and even then some, and he grew some unusual features. He's very goat-like in the face, and very hairy, and just strange looking, and something's off about him, and he's seeking a certain copy of a book called the Necronomicon, which is a book that pops up every now and again in the Lovecraft mythos, and that's essentially it so far. So, yeah, that's all I've got to say about it, and then we got the rest of the story to read, and we'll find out what happens. And as per last time, tonight we have a whiskey lemonade. Just very simple drink with lemonade, whiskey, and a sprig of rosemary. But I included several different variations of the drink within the recipe that is in the description. So check that out if you're interested. And without further ado, the Dunwich horror. Alright. Chapter 7. Yet all of this was only the prologue of the actual Dunwich horror. Formalities were gone through by bewildered officials. Abnormal details were duly kept from press and public. And men were sent to Dunwich in Aylesbury to look up property and notify any who might be heirs of the late Wilbur Whately. They found the countryside in great agitation, both because of the growing rumblings beneath the domed hills, and because the unwanted stench in the surging, lapping sounds which came increasingly from the great empty shell formed by Whately's boarded-up farmhouse. Earl Sawyer, who tended the horse and cattle during Wilbur's absence, had developed a woefully acute case of nerves. Sorry, I'm trying to find sufficient light in here. Okay, that's better. The officials devised excuses not to enter the noisome, boarded place, and were glad to confine their survey of the deceased living's quarters, the newly mended sheds, to a single visit. They filed a ponderous report at the courthouse in Aylesbury, and litigations concerning the airship are said to be still in progress amongst the innumerable Whateleys, decayed and undecayed, of the upper Miskatonic Valley. An almost interminable manuscript in strange characters, written in a huge ledger and adjusted a sort of diary because of the spacing and the variations in ink and penmanship, presented a baffling puzzle to those who found it on the old bureau which served at its owner's desk. After a week of debate, it was sent to Miskatonic University, together with the deceased's collections of strange books, for study and possible translation. But even the best linguists soon saw that it was not unlikely to be unriddled with ease. No trace of the ancient gold which Wilbur and old Whately always paid their debts has yet been discovered. It was in the dark of September 9th that the horror broke loose. The hill noises had been very pronounced during the evening, and dogs barked frantically all night. Early risers on the 10th noticed a peculiar stench in the air. About 7 o'clock, Luther Brown, the hired boy at George Corey's between Cold Spring Glen and the village, rushed frenziedly back from his morning trip to 10 Acre Meadow with the cows. He was almost convulsed with fright as he stumbled into the kitchen. And in the yard outside, the no less frightened herd were pawing and lowing pitifully. Having followed the boy back in a panic they shared with him, between gasps, Luther tried to stammer out his tale to Mrs. Corey. "Up thar, in the rud, beyond the glen, Miss Corey, they something be thar. It smells like thunder, and all the bushes and little trees is pushed back from the rud, like they'd house been moved along it. And that ain't we was neither. They prints in the rud." Sorry. Miss Corey, great round prints as big as barrelheads, all sunk down deep, like an elephant had been long. Only they's a sight more nor 4 feet could make. Sorry, the lighting is just, I have still not been able to work out a way to fiddle with the lighting to make it good enough for me so I can read. I looked at one or two afore I run, and I see every one was covered with lines spreadin' out that place like big palm leaf fans, 'twict or 3 times big as any of they had have been pounded down in the rud, and the smell was awful, like what it is around Wizard Whately's old house. Here, he faltered, and seemed to shiver afresh with the fright that had been sent him flying home. Mrs. Corey, unable to extract more information, began telephoning the neighbors, thus starting on its rounds of the overture of panic that heralded the major terrors. When she got Sally Sawyer, housekeeper at Seth Bishop's, the nearest place to the Whateleys, it became her turn to listen instead of transmit. For Sally's boy, Chauncey, who slept poorly, had been up on the hill toward Whately's, and had dashed back in terror after one look at the place, and at the pasturage where Mr. Bishop's cows had been left out all night. "Yes, Miss Corey," came Sally's tremulous voice over the party wire. "Chancey, he just came back a postin', and couldn't have talk for been scared. He says old Whately's house is all blowed up, with the timbers scattered around like they've been dynamite inside. Only the bottom floor ain't through, but is all covered with all kind of tar-like stuff that smells awful and drips down off the ledges onto the ground where the side timbers is blown away. And they's awful kind of remarks in the yard, too, a great round marks bigger than the hog's head, and all sticky with stuff like on the blowed-up house. Chancey says they leads off into the medders, where a great swath wider than a barn is matted down, and all the stone walls tumbled every which way wherever it goes. And he says he, Miss Corey, as how he sought to look for Seth's cows, frightened as he was, and found 'em in the upper pasture nigh the Devil's Hop yard in an awful shape. Half of 'em's gone, and nigh half of 'em that's left is sucked most dry blood, with sores on 'em, like they had been on Whately's cattle ever since Lavinia's black brat was born. Seth, he's gone out to look at 'em, though I'll vow he won't care to get nigh Wizard Whately's. Chancey's didn't look careful to see what big matted down swath led arter it left the pasturage, but he says he thinks it pinted towards the glen rud the village. I tell you, Miss Corey, they's suthin' abroad, and hadn't orter be abroad. And I think for one that Wilbur Whately has come back from the bad end he deserved. It is at the bottom of the breedin' of it. He wasn't all human himself, I must say to everybody, and I think that old Whately must have raised something in their nailed-up house, as ain't even so human as he was. They's allus been unseen things around Dunwich, living things as ain't human and ain't good for human folks. The growlin' was a-talkin' last night, and towards mornin', Chancey he heerd up the whippoorwills so loud that Cold Spring Glen he couldn't sleep none. Then he thought he heerd another faint-like sound over toward Wizard Whately's, a kinder rippin' of tearin' wood, like some big box or crate was being opened for off. What with this and that, he didn't get to sleep at all until sunup, and no sooner was he up that mornin', but he's got to go over to Whately's and seen what happens with the matter. He's seen enough. I tell you, Miss Corey, this don't mean no good, and I think all the men folks ought to get up and party and do something. I know something awful's about, and feel my time is nigh, though only God just knows what it is. Did your Luther take to account of what the big tracks led to? No? Well, Miss Corey, if they was on the Glen Rud, this side of the Glen, ain't got to the house yet. I calculate must go into the glen itself. They would do that. Iowa said Cold Spring Glen ain't no healthy nor decent place. The whippoorwills and fireflies, there never did act like any creatures of God. And they's them, as says your kin, hear strange things a rushin' and a talkin'. And the air down there, if you stand in the right place, atween the rock falls and bear's den. Sorry, there's sirens. Let me... Anyways. By that noon, fully 3/4 of the men and boys of Dunwich were trooping over the roads and meadows between the new-made Whately's ruins and Cold Spring Glen, examining in horror the vast monstrous prints, the maimed bishop cattle, and the strange, noisome wreck of the farmhouse, and the bruised, matted vegetation of the fields and roadsides. Whatever had burst loose up upon the world had assuredly gone down to the great sinister ravine, for all the trees on the banks were bent and broken, and a great avenue had been gouged into the precipice hanging on the brush. It was as though a house, launched by an avalanche, had slid down through the tangled growths of the almost vertical slope. From below no sound came, but only a distant, undefinable fetor, and it is not to be wondered at the men that preferred to stay on the edge and argue, rather than descend and beard the unknown cyclopean horror in its lair. 3 dogs that were in the party had barked furiously at first, but seemed cowed and reluctant when near the glen. Someone telephoned the news to the Aylesbury Transcript, but the editor, accustomed to wild tales from Dunwich, did no more than concoct a humorous paragraph about it, an item soon afterward reproduced by the Associated Press. That night, everyone went home, and every house and barn was barricaded as stoutly as possible. Needless to say, no cattle were allowed to remain in open pasturage. About 2 in the morning, a frightful stench and savage barking of the dogs awakened the household at Elmer Fry's, on the eastern edge of Cold Spring Glen, and all agreed that they could hear a sort of muffled swishing or lapping sound from somewhere inside. Mrs. Fry proposed telephoning the neighbors, and Elmer was about to agree when the noise of splintering wood burst in upon their deliberations. It came apparently from the barn, and was so quickly followed by a hideous screaming and stamping amongst the cattle. The dogs slavered and crouched close to the feet of the fear-numbered family. Fry lit a lantern through force of habit, but he knew it would be death to go out into that black farmyard. The children and womenfolk whimpered, kept from screaming by some obscure vestigial instinct of defense which told them their lives depended on silence. At last, the noise of the cattle subsided into pitiful moaning, and had a great snapping, crashing, and crackling ensued. The Frys, huddled together in the sitting room, did not dare to move till the last echoes died down, far down from the Cold Spring Glen. Then, amidst the dismal moans from the stable, and the demonic piping of late whippoorwills in the glen, Selina Fry tottered to the telephone and spread what news she could of the second phase of the horror. The next day, all the countryside was in a panic, and cowed, uncommunicative groups came and went where the fiendish thing had occurred. 2 titan swaths of destruction stretched from the glen to the Fry farmyard. Monstrous prints covered the bare patches of ground, and one side of the old red barn had completely caved in. Of the cattle, only a quarter could be found and identified. Some of these were the curious fragments, and all that survived had to be shot. Earl Sawyer suggested that help be asked from Aylesbury or Arkham, but others maintained it would be of no use. Old Zebulon Whately, of a branch that hovered about halfway between soundness and decadence, made darkly wild suggestions about rites that ought to be practiced on the hilltops. He came of a line where tradition ran strong, and his memories of chantings in the great stone circles were not altogether connected with Wilbur and his grandfather. Darkness fell upon a stricken countryside too passive to organize for real defense. In a few cases, closely related families would band together and watch in the gloom under one roof, but in general, there was only a repetition of the barricading of the night before, and a futile, ineffective gesture of loading muskets and setting pitchforks handily about. Nothing, however, occurred except some hill noises, and when the day came there were many who hoped that the new horror had gone as swiftly as it had come. There were even bold souls who proposed an offensive expedition down in the glen, though they did not venture to set an actual example to the still reluctant majority. When the night came again, the barricading was repeated, though there was less huddling together of the families. In the morning, both of the Fry and Seth Bishop households reported excitement among the dogs and vague sounds and stenches from afar, while early explorers noted with horror a fresh set of the monstrous tracks in the road skirting Sentinel Hill. As before, the sides of the road showed a bruising indicative of the blasphemously stupendous bulk of the horror, whilst the conformation of the tracks seemed to argue a passage of 2 directions, as if the moving mountain had come from Cold Spring Glen and returned to it along the same path. At the base of the hill, a 30-foot swath of crushed shrubbery, saplings led steeply upward, and the seekers gasped when they saw that even the most perpendicular places did not deflect the inexorable trail. Whatever the horror was, it could scale a sheer stony cliff of almost complete verticality, and as the investigators climbed around the hill summit by safer routes, they saw that the trail ended, or rather, reversed there. It was here that the Whateleys used to build their hellish fires and chant their hellish rituals by the table like stone on May Eve and Hallowmass. Now that the very stone formed the center of a vast space thrashed around the mountainous horror, whilst upon its slightly concave surface was a thick and fetid deposit of the same tarry thickness observed on the floor in the ruined Whately farmhouse when the horror escaped. Men looked at one another and muttered. Then they looked down the hill. Apparently, the horror had descended by a route much of the same as that of its ascent. To speculate was futile. Reason, logic, and normal ideas of motivation stood confounded, but only old Zebulon, who was not with the group, could have done justice to the situation or suggested a plausible explanation. Thursday night began much like the others, but it ended less happily. The whippoorwills in the glen had screamed with such unusual persistence that many could not sleep, and about 3 a.m. all the party telephones rang tremulously. Those who looked down the receivers heard such a fright-mad voice shriek out, "Help! Oh my God!" and some thought a crashing sound followed the breaking off of the exclamation. There was nothing more. No one dared do anything, and no one knew till morning whence the call came. And those who had heard it, it called everyone on the line, and found that only the Frys did not reply. The truth appeared an hour later, when a hastily assembled group of armed men trudged to the Fry place at the head of the glen. It was horrible, yet hardly a surprise. There were more swaths and monstrous prints, but there was no longer any house. It had caved in like an eggshell, and amongst the ruins nothing living or dead could be discovered. Only the stench and a tarry stickiness. The Elmer Frys had been erased from Dunwich. Chapter 8. In the meantime, a quieter, yet even more spiritually poignant phase of the horror had begun blackly unwinding itself behind the closed door of a shelf-lined room in Arkham. The curious manuscript, record, or diary of Wilbur Whately, delivered to Miskatonic University for translation, had caused much worry and bafflement among the experts in languages. Its very alphabet, notwithstanding a general resemblance to the heavily shaded Arabic used in Mesopotamia, being absolutely unknown to any available authority, the final conclusion of the linguists was that of the text represented an artificial alphabet giving the effect of a cipher, though none of the usual methods of cryptographic solution seemed to furnish any clue. Even when applied on the basis of every tongue, the writer might conceivably have used the ancient books taken from Whately's quarters, while absorbingly interesting in the several cases proposing to open up a new and terrible lines of the research among this matter. One of them, a heavy tome with an iron clasp, was in another unknown alphabet, this one of a very different cast, resembling Sanskrit more than anything else. The old ledger was at length given wholly to the charge of Dr. Armitage, both because of his peculiar interest in the Whately matter, and because of his wide linguistic learning and skill in the mystical formulae of antiquity in the Middle Ages. Armitage had an idea that the alphabet may be something esoterically used by certain forbidden cults which have come down from old times, and which have inherited many forms and traditions from the wizards of the Saracenic world. That question, however, he did not deem vital, since it would be unnecessary to know the origin of the symbols if, as he suspected, they were used as a cipher in the modern language. It was his belief that, considering the great amount of text involved, the writer would scarcely have wished the trouble of using another speech than his own, save, perhaps, a certain special formulae and incantations. Accordingly, he attacked the manuscript with the preliminary assumption that the bulk of it was in English. Dr. Armitage knew from the repeated failures of his colleagues that the riddle was a deep and complex one, and that no simple mode of solution could merit even a trial. All through late August, he fortified himself with the massive lore of cryptography, drawing upon the fullest resources of his own library, and waiting night after night amidst the arcana of Trithemius's Polygraphia, Giambatta's Portas, De Furtivis Litterum Notis, and De Viginere. That's French. It's very complex French. I don't know that name. Trait des chiffres, falconers, cryptum isis, patafacta, Davies, and thickness 18th century treatises, and for such fairly modern authorities as Blair, von Martin, and Kluber's cryptographic. He interspersed his study of the books with attacks on the manuscript himself, and in time became convinced that he had to deal with one of the subtlest and most ingenious of cryptograms, in which many separate lists of corresponding letters are arranged like the multiplication table, and the message built up with arbitrary keywords known only to the initiated. The older authorities seemed rather more helpful than the newer ones, and Armitage concluded that the code of manuscript was one of great antiquity, no doubt handed down through a long line of mystical experimenters. Several times he seemed near daylight, only to be set back by some unforeseen obstacle. Then, as September approached, the clouds began to clear. Certain letters, as used in certain parts of the manuscript, emerged definitely and unmistakably. It became obvious that the text was indeed in English. On the evening of September 2nd, the last major barrier gave way, and Dr. Armitage read for the first time a continuous passage of Wilbur Whately's annals. This, in truth, was a diary, as all had thought, and it was couched in a style clearly showing the mixed occult erudition and general illiteracy of the strange being who wrote it. Almost the first long passage that Armitage deciphered, an entry dated November 26, 1916, proved highly startling and disquieting. It was written, he remembered, by a child of 3.5 who looked like a lad of 12 or 13. Sorry, 1 second. Today learned the ACLO for the Sabaoth. It ran, which did not like. It began answerable from the bill, and not from the air. That upstairs more ahead of me than I thought it would be, and is not like to have much earth brain. Shot Elam Hutchinson's collie Jack when he went to bite me, and Elam says he would kill me if he dashed. I guess he won't. Grandfather kept me saying the dough formula last night, and I think I saw the inner city, at least the 2 magnetic poles. I shall go to those poles when the earth is cleared off. If I can't break through with the Do-Hina formula when I commit it, they from the air told me at Sabat that it will be years before I can clear off the earth. And I guess grandfather will be dead by then. So I shall have to learn all the angles of the planes and all the formulas between Ur and Ur. They from outside will help, but they cannot take body without human blood. That upstairs looks like it will have the right cast. I can see it a little when I make the Voorish sign or blow the powder of Ibn Ghazi at it, and it was near like them at May Eve on the hill. The other face may wear off some. I wonder how I shall look when the earth is cleared and there are no earth beings in it. He that came with the Aklos Sabaoth said I may be transfigured, there being much of outside to work on. Sorry, hold on a sec. Someone thinks that everybody needs to hear their music. They really want you to hear it. Anyways. Morning found Dr. Armitage in a cold sweat of terror and a frenzy of wakeful concentration. He had not left the manuscript all night, but sat at his table under the electric light, turning page after page with shaking hands as fast as he could decipher the cryptic text. He had nervously telephoned his wife he would not be home, and when she brought him breakfast from the house, he could scarcely dispose of a mouthful. All that day he read on, now and then halted maddeningly as a reapplication of the complex key became necessary. Lunch and dinner were brought to him, but he ate only the smallest fraction of either. Towards the middle of the next night, he drowsed off in his chair, but soon woke out of a tangle of nightmares almost as hideous as the truths and menaces to man's existence that he had uncovered. On the morning of September 4th, Professor Rice and Dr. Morgan insisted on seeing him for a while, and departed trembling and ashen gray. That evening he went to bed, but slept only fitfully. Wednesday, the next day, he was back at the manuscript, and began to take copious notes, both from the current sections and from those he had already deciphered. In the small hours of that night, he slept a little in an easy chair in his office, but was at the manuscript again before dawn. Some time before noon, his physician, Dr. Hartwell, called to see him and insisted that he cease work. He refused, intimating that it was of the most vital importance for him to complete the reading of the diary, promising an explanation in due course of time. That evening, just as twilight fell, he finished his terrible pursuit and sank back exhausted. His wife, bringing him dinner, found him in a half-comatose state, but he was conscious enough to warn her off with a sharp cry when he saw her eyes wander toward the notes that he had taken. Weakly rising, he gathered up the scribbled papers and sealed them all in a great envelope, which he immediately placed inside his coat pocket. he had sufficient strength to get home, but was so clearly in need of medical aid that Dr. Hartwell was summoned at once. As the doctor put him to bed, he could only mutter over and over again, "But what, in God's name, can we do?" Dr. Armitage slept, but was partly delirious the next day. He made no explanations to Hartwell, but in his calmer moments spoke of the imperative need of a long conference with Rice and Morgan. His wilder wanderings were very startling indeed, including frantic appeals that something in a boarded-up farmhouse be destroyed, and fantastic references to some plan for their extirpation of the entire human race and all animal and vegetable life from Earth by some terrible elder race of beings from another dimension. He would shout that the world was in danger, since the elder things wished to strip it and drag it away from the solar system and cosmos of matter into some other plane or phase of entity which it had once fallen eons ago. At other times, he would call for the dreaded Necronomicon and the Demonotaria of Remigus, which he seemed hopeful of finding some formula to check the peril he had conjured up. Stop them, he would shout. "Those Whateleys meant to let them in, and the worst of all is left. Tell Rice and Morgan we must do something. It's a blind business, but I know how to make the powder. It hasn't been fed since the 2nd of August, when Wilbur came here to his death. And at that rate, Dr. Armitage had but a sound physique, despite his 73 years, and slept off his disorder that night without developing any real fever. He woke late Friday, clear of head, though sober with a gnawing fear and tremendous sense of responsibility. Saturday afternoon, he felt he was able to go over to the library and summon Rice and Morgan for a conference. And that rest of the day and evening, the three men tortured their brains in the wildest speculation and the most desperate debate. Sorry, hold on a sec. All the sirens like to go down my street. Strange and terrible books were drawn voluminously from the stacked shelves and from secure places of storage, and diagrams and formula were copied with feverish haste and in bewildering abundance. Of skepticism there was none. All three had seen the body of Wilbur Whately as it lay on the floor in a room of that very building, and after that not one of them could feel even slightly inclined to treat the diary as a madman's raving. Opinions were divided as to notifying the Massachusetts State Police, and the negative finally won. There were things involved which simply could not be believed by those who had not seen a sample, as indeed it was made clear during certain subsequent investigations. Late at night, the conference disbanded without having developed a definite plan, but all day Sunday, Armitage was busy building formula and mixing chemicals obtained from the college laboratory. The more he reflected on the hellish diary, the more he was inclined to doubt the efficacy of any material agent in stamping out the entity which Wilbur Whately had left behind him. The earth-threatening entity which, unknown to him, was to burst forth in a few hours and become the memorable Dunwich horror. Monday was a repetition of Sunday with Dr. Armitage, for the task in hand required an infinity of research and experiment. further conclusions of the monstrous diary brought about various changes of plan, and he knew that even in the end, a large amount of uncertainty must remain. By Tuesday, he had a definite line of action mapped out, and believed he would try a trip to Dunwich within a week. Then on Wednesday, the great shock came. Tucked obscurely away in a corner of Argument Advertiser was a facetious little item from the Associated Press, telling what a record-breaking monster the bootleg whiskey of Dunwich had raised up. Armitage, half stunned, could only telephone for Rice and Morgan. Far into the night they discussed, and the next day was a whirlwind of preparation on the part of them all. Armitage knew that he would be meddling with terrible powers, yet saw that there was no other way to annul the deeper and more malign meddling which others had done before him. Chapter 9. Friday morning, Armitage, Rice, and Morgan set out by motor for Dunwich, arriving at the village about 1 in the afternoon. The day was pleasant, but even in the brightest sunlight, a kind of quiet dread, important, seemed to hover about the strangely domed hills and the deep, shadowy ravines of the stricken region. Now and then, on some mountain top, a gaunt circle of stones could be glimpsed against the sky. From the air, a hushed fright at Osborne Shore. They knew something hideous had happened, and soon learned of the annihilation of the Elmer Fry house and family. Throughout that afternoon, they rode around Dunwich, questioning the natives concerning all that had occurred, and seeing for themselves with rising pangs of horror the drear Fry ruins with their lingering traces of the tarry sickness and the blasphemous tracks in the Fry yard. The wounded Seth Bishop cattle and the enormous swaths of disturbed vegetation in various places. The trail up and down Sentinel Hill seemed to Armitage of almost cataclysmic significance, and he looked long at the sinister altar-like stone on the summit. At length, the visitors, apprised of a party of state police, which had come from Aylesbury in the morning in response to the first telephone reports of the Fry tragedy, decided to seek out the officers and compare notes as far as practicable. This, however, they found more easily planned than performed, since no sign of the party could be found in any direction. There had been 5 of them in the car, but now the car stood empty near the ruins of the Fry yard. The natives, all of whom had talked with the policeman, seemed at first perplexed as Armitage and his companions. Then old Sam Hutchins thought of something and turned pale, nudging Fred Farr and pointing to the dank, deep hollow that yawned close by. "I tell them not to go down the glen, and I never thought nobody do it. With the tracks and smell and the whippoorwills a-screechin' down there in the dark o' noonday." A cold shudder ran through the natives and visitors alike, and every ear seemed strained in a kind of instinctive, unconscious listening. Armitage, now that he had actually come upon the horror in its monstrous work, trembled with the responsibility he felt to be his. Night would soon fall, and it was then that the mountainous blasphemy lumbered upon its eldritch course. Negocium perambulus in tenebris, the old librarian rehearsed the formula that he had memorized. and clutched the paper containing the alternative one that he had not memorized. He saw that his electric flashlight was in working order. Rice, beside him, took from a valise a metal sprayer of the sort used when combating insects, whilst Morgan uncased a big game rifle, which he relied, despite the colleague's warnings, that no material weapon would be of help. Armitage, having read the hideous diary, knew painfully well what kind of manifestation to expect, but he did not add to the fright of the Dunwich people by giving any hints or clues. He had hoped that it might be conquered without any revelation to the world of its monstrous thing that had escaped. As the shadows gathered, the natives commenced to disperse homeward, anxious to bar themselves indoors despite the present evidence that all human locks and bolts were useless before a force that could bend trees and crush houses when it chose. They shook their heads at the visitors' plan to stand guard at the Fry ruin near the glen, and as they left, had a little expectancy of ever seeing the watchers again. There were rumblings under the hills that night, and the whippoorwills piped threateningly. Once in a while, a wind, sweeping out from Cold Spring Glen, would bring a touch of inevitable fetor to the... Did not expect that. As all three watchers had smelled once before, when they stood above a dying thing that had passed for 15 years and a half as a human being. But the looked-for terror did not appear. Whatever was down there in the glen was biding its time, and Armitage told his colleagues that it would be suicidal to try to attack it in the dark. Morning came wanly, and the night sounds ceased. It was a gray, bleak day, and now and then a drizzle of rain and heavier clouds seemed to be piling themselves up beyond the hills to the northwest. The men from Arkham were undecided what to do, seeking shelter from the increasing rainfall beneath one of the few undestroyed Fry buildings. They debated the wisdom of waiting, or of taking the aggressive and going down the glen in a quest of their nameless, monstrous quarry. The downpour waxed in heaviness, and distant peals of thunder sounded from far horizons. Sheet lightning shimmered, and then a forky bolt flashed near at hand, as if descending into the accursed glen itself. The sky grew very dark, and the watchers hoped that the storm would prove a short, sharp one, followed by clear weather. It was still gruesomely dark when, not much over an hour later, a confused babble of voices sounded down the road. Another moment brought a view of a frightened group of more than a dozen men, running, shouting, and even whimpering hysterically. Someone in the lead began sobbing out words, and the Arkham men started violently when those words developed into a coherent form. It's going again, and this time by day, and it's out a-movin' this very minute, and only the Lord knows when it'll be upon us all. The speaker panted in the silence, but another took up his message. Nigh an hour ago, Zeb Whately here heard the phone a-ringin', and it was Miss Corey, George's wife, that lives down by the junction. She says the hired boy Luther was out driving in the cows from the storm after a big bolt, when he see all the trees a-bendin' and the mouth of the glen. Opposite side to this, and a smell came, and an awful smell like he smelt when he found the big tracks last Monday morning. And she says that they be swishin', lappin', and a sound more nor than the bending of the trees and bushes could make. And all that sudden the trees begun to get pushed to one side, and they was an awful stomping and splashing in the mud. But mind ye, Luther, he didn't see nothing at all, only the bending trees and underbrush. Then, for ahead where Bishop's Brook goes down the rud, he heard an awful creaking and straining under the bridge, and says he could not tell the sound of wood a-starting into crack and split. And all the whiles he could never see a thing, only them trees and bushes a-bending. And when the swishing sound got very far off on the road towards Wizard Whately's and Sentinel Hill, Luther, he had the guts to step up where he heard the first and look around the ground. It was all mud and water, and the sky was dark in the rain and wiping out all the rocks and tracks about the fast as he could be. But beginning at the glen mouth where the trees had moved, they was still some of the awful prints as big as barrels seen last Monday. At this point, the first excited speaker interrupted. But that ain't the trouble now. That was only the start. Zeb here was calling folks up, and everybody was a-listening, and when a call from Seth Bishop's cut in, his housekeeper, Sally, was carrying for to kill. She just seed the trees a-bending beside the rud, and says they kind of mushy sound, like an elephant puffing and treading and heading for a house. Then she up and spoke sudden a fierce smell, and says her boy Chauncey was screaming as how he just like when he smoked up the Whately ruins. It's spelled weird. Monday morning, and the dogs was all barking and whining awful. Lines of fright deepened on every face, and Armitage, shaken as he was, had barely poise enough to prompt the speaker. And then Sally, she yelled out, "Oh, help, the house is a-caving in," and on the wire he could hear a terrible crashing and a whole flock screaming, just like when Elmer Fry's place was took down, only wuss. The man paused, and another crowd spoke. "That's all, not a sound nor squeak over the phone, arter that, just still like. We heard it got out of the Fords and wagons and rounded up as many able-bodied men folks as we could get at Corey's place, and come up here to see for what you thought best to do. Not but I thinks that the Lord's judgment for our antiquities, that no mortal can ever set aside." Armitage saw that he had time for positive action, and had come and spoke decisively to the faltering group of frightened rustics. "We must follow it, boys," he made his voice reassuring as possible. "I believe there's a chance of putting it out of its business. You men know those Whateleys were wizards. Well, this thing is of wizardry, and it must be put down by the same means. I've seen Wilbur Whately's diary. I've read some of the strange books that he used to read, and I think I know the right kind of spell to recite and make a thing fade away. Of course, one can't be sure, but we can always take a chance. It's invisible. I knew it would be, but there's a powder in this long-distance sprayer that might make it show up for a second. Later on, we'll try it. It's a frightful thing to have alive, but it isn't as bad as what Wilbur would have let it in if he had lived longer. You'll never know what world has escaped. Now, we've only this one thing to fight, and it can't multiply. Can, though, do lots of harm. We mustn't hesitate to rid the community of it. We must follow, and the way to begin is to go to the place that it had just been wrecked. let somebody lead the way. I don't know your roads very well, but I have an idea where it might be shorter cut across lots. How about it? The men shuffled about a moment, and then Earl Sawyer spoke softly, pointing to a grimy finger through the steadily lessening rain. I guess he can get to the Seth Bishop's quickest by cutting across the lower meadow here, wade in the brook at the low place, and climbing through Carrier's Mountain and the timber lot beyond. That comes to the upper rud, mighty nigh Seth's, a leetle to other side. Armitage, with Rice and Morgan, started to walk in the direction indicated, and most of the natives followed slowly. The sky was growing lighter, and there were signs that the storm had worn itself away. When Armitage inadvertently took a wrong direction, Joe Osborne warned him and walked ahead to show the right one. Courage and confidence were mounting, though the twilight of the almost perpendicular wooded hill, which lay toward the end of the shortcut, and almost whose fantastic ancient trees they had to scramble as if of a ladder, put these qualities to a severe test. At length, they emerged on a muddy road to find the sun coming out. They were a little beyond Seth Bishop's place, but bent trees and hideously unmistakable tracks showed what had passed by. Only a few moments were consumed in surveying the ruins around the bend. It was the fright incident all over again. Nothing dead or living was found in either of the collapsed shells, which had been the Bishop house and the barn. No one cared to remain there amidst the stench and tarry stickiness, but all turned instinctively to the line of horrible prints leading up toward the wrecked house and the altar-crowned slopes of Sentinel Hill. As the men passed the site of Wilbur Whately's abode, they shuddered visibly, and seemed again to mix hesitancy with their zeal. It was no joke, tracking down something as big as a house that one could not see, but that had all the vicious malevolence of a demon. Opposite of the base of Sentinel Hill, the tracks left the road, and there was a fresh bending and matting visible along the broad swath, marking the monster's former route to and from the summit. Armitage produced a pocket telescope of considerable power and scanned the steep green side of the hill. Then he handed the instrument to Morgan, whose sight was keener. After a moment of gazing, Morgan cried out sharply, passing the glass to Earl Sawyer, and indicating a certain spot on the slope with his finger. Sawyer, as clumsy as most non-users of optical devices are, fumbled a while, but eventually focused the lenses with Armitage's aid. When he did so, his cry was less restrained than Morgan's had been. God Almighty, the grass and bushes be a-movin'. It's a-goin' up, slow-like, creepin' up ter the top at this minute. Heaven only knows what for. Then the germ of panic seemed to spread among the seekers. It was one thing to chase the nameless entity, but quite another to find it. Spells might be all right, but suppose they weren't. Voices began questioning Armitage about how they knew this thing, and no reply seemed quite to satisfy. Everyone seemed to feel himself in close proximity to the phases of nature, in being utterly forbidden and wholly outside the sane experience of mankind. Chapter 10. In the end, the 3 men from Arkham, old white-bearded Dr. Armitage, stocky, iron-gray Professor Rice, and lean, youngish Dr. Morgan, ascended the mountain alone. After much patient instruction regarding the focusing and use, they left out the telescope with the frightened group that remained in the road. And as they climbed, they watched closely by those among whom glass was passed around. It was hard going, and Armitage had to be helped more than once. High above the toiling group, the great swath trembled, as its hellish maker repassed with snail-like deliberateness. It was obvious that pursuers were gaining. Curtis Whately, of the undecayed branch, was holding the telescope when the Arkham party detoured radically from the swath. He told the crowd that the men were evidently trying to get a subordinate peak which overlooked the swath at a point considerably ahead, where the shrubbery was now bending. This indeed proved to be true, and the party were seen to gain a minor elevation only a short time after the invisible blasphemy had passed it. Then Wesley Corey had taken the glass, cried out that Armitage was adjusting the sprayer, which Rice held, and that something must be about to happen. The crowd stirred uneasily, recalling that this sprayer was expected to give the unseen horror a moment of visibility. 2 or 3 men shut their eyes, but Curtis Whately snatched back the telescope and strained his vision to the utmost. He saw that Rice, from the party's point of vantage above and behind the entity, had an excellent chance of spreading the potent powder with marvelous effect. Those without the telescope only saw an instant flash of gray cloud, a cloud about the size of a moderately large building near the top of the mountain. Curtis, who had held the instrument, dropped it with a piercing shriek into the ankle-deep mud of the road. He reeled and would have crumpled to the ground, had not for 2 or 3 others seized and steadied him. All he could do was moan half inaudibly, "Oh, great God, that. There was a pandemonium of questioning, and only Henry Wheeler thought to rescue the fallen telescope and wipe it clean of the mud. Curtis was past all coherence, and even isolated replies were almost too much for him. Bigger than a barn, all made of squirming ropes, whole thing sort of shaped like a hen's egg, bigger than anything, with dozens of legs like hogsheads that half shut up when they step, nothing solid about it, all like jelly, and made to separate wiggling ropes, pushed close together, great bulging eyes all over it, 10 or 20 mouths or trunks sticking out all sides, big and as stovepipes, and all tossing and open and shutting, all gray with kinder blue or purple things, and God in heaven, that half face on top. This final memory, whatever it was, proved too much for poor Curtis, and he collapsed completely before he could say more. Fred Farr and Will Hutchins carried him to the roadside and laid him in the damp grass. Henry Wheeler, trembling, turned and rescued the telescope on the mountainside to see what he might, though the lenses were discernible through the lenses were discernible 3 tiny figures, apparently running toward the summit as fast as the steep incline allowed. Only these, nothing more. Then everyone noticed a strange, unseasonable noise in the deep valley behind. And even in the underbrush of Sentinel Hill itself, it was the piping of unnumbered whippoorwills, and in their shrill chorus there seemed to lurk a note of tense and evil expectancy. Earl Sawyer now took the telescope and reported the three figures as standing in the topmost ridge, virtually level with the altar stone, but a considerable distance from it. One figure, he said, seemed to be raising its hands above its head at rhythmic intervals, and as Sawyer mentioned the circumstance, the crowd seemed to hear a faint, half-musical sound from the distance, as if a loud chant were accompanying the gestures. The weird silhouette on that remote peak must have been a spectacle of infinite grotesqueness and impressiveness, but no observer was in a mood for aesthetic appreciation. "I guess he's saying the spell," whispered Wheeler, as he snatched back the telescope. The whippoorwills were piping wildly, and in a singularly curious irregular rhythm, quite unlike that of the visible ritual. Suddenly, the sunshine seemed to lessen without the intervention of any discernible cloud. It was a very peculiar phenomenon, and was plainly marked by all. A rumbling sound seemed brewing beneath the hills, mixed strangely with a concordant rumbling which clearly came from the sky. Lightning flashed aloft, and the wondering crowd looked in vain for the portents of storm. The chanting of the men from Arkham now became unmistakable, and Wheeler saw through the glass that they were raising their arms in rhythmic incantation. From some farmhouse far away came the frantic barking of dogs. The change in the quality of the daylight increased, and the crowd gazed upon the horizon in wonder. A purplish darkness, born of nothing more than spectral deepening of the sky's blue, pressed down upon the rumbling hills, and the lightning flashed again, somewhat brighter than before, and the crowd fancied that it showed a certain mistiness around the altar stone on the distant height. No one, however, had been using the telescope at that instant. The whippoorwills continued their irregular pulsation, and the men of Dunwich braced themselves tensely against some imponderable menace with which the atmosphere seemed surcharged. Without warning came those deep, cracked, raucous vocal sounds which will never leave the memory of the stricken group who heard them. Not from any human throat they were born, for the organs of man can yield no such acoustic perversions. Rather, would one have said they came from the pit itself, had not their source been so unmistakably from altar stone on the peak. It was almost erroneous to call them sounds at all, since so much of the ghastly infrabass tones spoke in dim seats of the consciousness and terror far subtler than the air, yet must do so since their form was indisputably through vaguely that half-articulate words. They were loud as the rumblings and the thunder above which they echoed, yet they did come from no visible being, and because imagination might suggest a conjectural source in the world of non-visible beings, the huddled crowd at the mountain's base huddled still closer and winced as if expectation of a blow. Yanai, Tirhan, Yoxatoth, rang the hideous croaking of out of space. Yai, Nikolai. The speaking impulse seemed to falter there, as if some frightful psychic struggle there was going on. Henry Wheeler strained his eye at the telescope, but only saw the three grotesquely silhouetted human figures on the peak, all moving their arms furiously in strange gestures as their incantation drew near its culmination. From what black wells of Acherontic fear or feeling, from what unplumbed gulfs of extra-cosmic consciousness or obscure, long-latent heredity, were those half-articulate thunder croakings drawn. Presently, they began to gather renewed force, coherence, as they grew in stark, utter, ultimate frenzy. Eya, ya, ya, eya, nga, nga. Hayua, help, elf, father, Yog-Sothoth. But that was all. The pallid group on the road, still reeling, the indisputably English syllables that poured thickly and thunderously from the frantic vacancy beside the shocking altar stone, were never to hear such syllables again. Instead, they jumped violently at the terrific report that seemed to rend the hills, the deafening cataclysmic peal, whose source, be the inner earth or sky, no hearer was ever able to place. The single lightning bolt shot down from the purple zenith to the altar stone, and a great tidal wave of viewless force and an indescribable stench swept down from the hill to all countryside. Trees, grass, and underbrush were whipped into a fury, and the frightened crowd at the mountain's base, weakened by the lethal fetter which had seemed to asphyxiate them, and were almost hurled off their feet. Dogs howled in the distance, and over the field and forest were scattered the bodies of dead whippoorwills. The stench left quickly, but the vegetation never came right again. To this day, there is something queer and unholy about the growths on and around the fearsome hill. Curtis Whately was only just regaining consciousness when the Arkham men came slowly down the mountain, into the beams of sunlight once more brilliant and untainted. They were grave and quiet, and seemed shaken by memories and reflections even more terrible than those which had reduced the groups of natives to a state of cowed quivering. In reply to a jumble of questions, they only shook their heads and reaffirmed one vital fact. The thing is gone forever. It has been split up into what it was originally made of, and can at last never exist again. It was an impossibility in a normal world. Only the least fraction was really matter in any sense we know. It was like its father, and most of all, it had gone back to him, some vague realm or dimension outside our material universe, some vague abyss outside of which only the most accursed rites of human blasphemy could ever have called him for a moment upon the hills, said Armitage. There was a brief silence, and in that pause the scattered senses of poor Curtis Whately began to knit back and forth of continuity, so that he put his hands on his head with a moan. Memory seemed to pick itself up where it left off, and the horror of the sight that had prostrated him burst in upon again. Oh God, the face, that half face on top of it, that face with the red eyes and crinkly albino hair and no chin like the Whateleys. It was an octopus, centipede, spider kind of thing, and the half-shaped face on top of it, it looked like Wizard Whately's, only it was yards and yards across. He paused, exhausted, as the whole group of natives stared in bewilderment, not quite crystallized into fresh terror. Only old Zebulon Whately, who wanderingly remembered ancient things, but who had been silent heretofore, spoke aloud. 15 years gone, he rambled. I heard old Whately say as he how some day we'd hear a child, a Levinis, a callin' its father's name upon Sentinel Hill. Joe Osborne interrupted him to question the Arkham men. What it was anyhow, and it however did young Wizard Whately call it about in the air to come from? Armitage chose his words very carefully. It was mostly a kind of force that doesn't belong in our part of space. A kind of force that acts and grows and shapes itself by other laws than those of our sort of nature. We have no business calling in such things from the outside, and only very wicked people and very wicked cults ever try to. There was some of it in Wilbur Whately himself, enough to make a devil and precocious monster of him, and to make his passing out of pretty terrible sight. I'm going to burn his accursed diary, and if you men are wise, you'll dynamite the altar stone up there, and pull down the rings of standing stones on the other hills. Things like that brought down the beings whose Whateleys were so fond of. These beings, they are not going to let in it tangibly to wipe out the human race and drag the earth off to some nameless place for some nameless purpose. But as to this thing we've just sent back, the Whateleys raised it for a terrible part in the doings that were to come. It grew fast and big from the same reason that Wilbur grew fast and big. But it beat him because it had a greater share of the outsideness in it. You needn't ask how Wilbur called it out of the air. He didn't just call it out. It was his twin brother, but it looked more like his father than he did. That was the Dunwich Horror. We will pick up the next story. It's called The Haunter in the Dark. That will not be for a while, though. Sorry, I had a mustache hair in my mouth. So, what I wanted to say, I will not be doing this series until November. I will be doing something different in October, and it's a bit different. It's only going to last for the whole of October, but hopefully you guys will like it. I would like to call it a little thing called October. I will be reading some Edgar Allan Poe, some creepy poems, to keep in the spirit of October. And I will do 4 episodes of October for the month of October. And yeah, I hope you guys will enjoy it. I'm looking forward to it. And I appreciate you for joining me tonight. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and if you're feeling generous, share with a friend. And yes, I will leave it at that.